I am here alone tonight. We do not have Dr. J with us. He may be joining us. What we're going to be doing tonight is, before I get into that, I'd like to thank Revolution Radio for allowing me to broadcast here. I'm having an excellent time doing it. We've had a great response. I enjoy the platform that they provide for us to broadcast. And in turn, I'd like to encourage everyone to find your way to Revolution's freedomslips.com and find the donate button and throw in $1 or $2, $5 if you can. It is free radio, but the support is very helpful. It pays the bills. It allows us all to broadcast and get the words out there. A lot of good investigations, many other great shows on here provide a lot of real information that you don't find in mainstream, all the news you're looking for. You'll also find the seed pack that's offered there. I would recommend someone taking a look at that. It's really a lot more than a seed pack. It comes with all the information you would need. God forbid you ever really needed to grab this bag and get out of town. It will provide you with everything you need to start again, or how to maintain cultivation, irrigation, water filtration. You get 34,000 seeds, a little over 34,000 seeds, and if you keep them in the refrigerator, you'll last 15 years with those, 25 years if you put them in the freezer. This could be found right there on freedomslips.com for a $100 donation. You'll get everything in a breakout bag, a seed pack, everything you need. With that said, what we're going to be doing tonight is we usually like to have a guest on live, and this week it didn't quite work out that way. We have Dr. Silverman that was recorded earlier in the week with Dr. J and a Mad Painter. Again, thank you, Mad Painter, for getting in there and helping the interview go down and get the recording going. Dr. Silverman is the leading researcher in regards to the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin has been heavily debated for as long as it's been known to exist. Its hold is a holy relic. Some call it a hoax. There's a lot of properties about it that really aren't understood, or at least weren't understood when the first science team was allowed to examine it. It didn't really sit well with a lot of scientists and researchers alike. The information, it wasn't consistent. It gave loose structures and holes everywhere, and they did what they could. It's heavily protected. It's not brought out all the time. It's certainly not allowed to be examined. It's revered as a true relic, and we're going to be playing the recording of that tonight. And in between, I will be speaking about it and answering questions or taking calls in regards to it. And with further ado, we'll get to it right now. All right, here we go.
We are back with renowned world expert Dr. Andrew Silverman of the Shroud of Turin. Dr. Silverman, how are you today?
Very well, thank you. Yes, nice to be here.
The pleasure is all ours. You are coming to us straight from the United Kingdom, and you are one of the world's leading experts, if not the world's leading expert on the Shroud of Turin.
Well, not sure about that really, but it is a subject that does fascinate me. I wouldn't describe myself as a leading in anything, but yes, it's something I'm very fascinated by.
Several people we have spoken to consider you one of the top leading experts, and that's what we appreciate. But we wanted to focus on your work. In essence, can we start with your background leading up to this?
Sure, yes. Well, I have a background in science, and in particular medicine. I'm a medical doctor, and I've been interested since childhood, really, in this object, the Turin Shroud. It started when I was about 13 years old, and somebody showed me a TV program called The Silent Witness that had originally been a movie, actually, about the Turin Shroud, talking about the research that had been done on it back in the 70s, showing some amazing and unique properties of this image, which nobody could account for how this image could have formed, even using 20th century technology at the time, and even now with 21st century technology, no one knows how to replicate an image that has the same characteristics of the Turin Shroud, which we can discuss later.
Absolutely, and one of the main things I love about it is that the dimensions of it, it's a two-dimensional shroud, but the dimensions of what appear to be on it are three-dimensional, correct?
Well, that's right. I mean, basically, it's about 14 foot long, and on the shroud, it's a linen cloth, basically, and on there you can see several different kinds of marks. There's the bloodstains formed by a simple contact process, which is that there isn't controversy about how the bloodstains formed, but it's the clues that they give us regarding who the man was, and also the nature of the image that are really the fascinating thing to me.
Now, we just described what it is and what's on there, but let's give the listeners out there a little quick history lesson of what. Okay, I guess might as well just drop the bombshell of what most people know when they know the Shroud of Turin. It's been postulated that it was Jesus Christ who was wrapped in this shroud, correct?
Yes, it does seem that historically that this could have been the historical Jesus of Nazareth that was once wrapped in the shroud. Now, I should say at the outset that I'm looking at this from a sort of trying to look at this from a scientific, rational perspective, trying to get beyond and outside the dogmas of both religion and organized religion, also assumptions that are often assumed within science, but just to look at the evidence and try and use reason to see where that evidence might lead us. So if you actually look at the history of this object, which is currently known as the Turin Shroud, and before it was in Europe, it had other names, of course. But now the thing is that it had been in Western Europe since around the 14th century, and before that, there's plenty of evidence that it was actually in Constantinople, and before that, in a place that's now called Sanliurfa in Turkey, but that was then called Edessa. And you see, there's a story that's still around to this day that in Edessa there was a king, King Abgar, around the 1st century, and that this king was very ill, and he sent a letter a message to Jesus of Nazareth via messenger to say that I've heard that you have the power to help people who are very unwell. I wonder if you might come and visit me and help. And the story goes that actually he sent that one of his followers came instead, and Jesus had already died, but he brought the cloth that had once wrapped him, or that had a mysterious image upon it, and that's when Abgar was healed. Now, the thing is that if you actually study, I should get one thing out of the way as well, because when people hear about the Turin Shroud, the first thing that they think about is the carbon dating, because as many people know, in around 1988-89, there was a joint collaborative carbon dating between 3 different laboratories. Now, there had been originally a protocol for the carbon dating that was supposed to have involved 7 different laboratories using 2 different methods and using samples from all over the cloth. But actually what happened was they only used a sample from one corner of the cloth that had been severely damaged through being handled and having bits removed for people, wanting to hunt relics and so on, or sell them. And there's evidence to suggest that this corner had been repaired with more modern material in the 16th century. And so, but despite this was this evidence which has later come to light and wasn't known at the time. But despite this, they didn't follow the protocol and chose that particular corner, not I don't think through any kind of conspiracy or anything, but just through not doing good science, basically. They took a sample from this corner only, contaminated, and they dated it as being between 1260 and 1390. Now, the thing is that I was a medical student doing a science degree in the middle of my medical course at the time when this paper came out. So because I was doing a science degree, I used to read the journal Nature every week, and so I remember about the carbon dating, and what struck me was that if you looked in the corner where they actually had the statistics, you could see that even according to the three laboratories' own statistics, they suggested that at what scientists would call the 95% confidence limit, you could say that the three samples which were taken from just next to each other, a tiny bit of the corner of the cloth, within the quoted error ranges, they didn't have the same age as each other. They had significantly different ages, even within that tiny little 7-centimeter strip of cloth. And it appears as though they had different proportions of the original shroud, which for many reasons, which I'll go on to later, does appear to be from at least back from around the 1st century AD. And then with what may well have been 16 cloth that was then used to repair it. And this was spotted by a couple in the States called Sue Benford and Joe Marino, that they noticed there was a discrepancy in that corner of the cloth, that it didn't appear like the rest of the cloth. And they looked into it and found that there was this procedure which is still around. One of the team was Raymond Rogers from Los Alamos laboratories. You've probably heard of it. That's the same lab that 30 years earlier where they had made the atom bomb originally. So he was a chemist, a researcher from Los Alamos, and he, after studying the shroud as part of the STURT team, came to the conclusion this has not been fabricated. I don't know how this image formed, but it wasn't made by a medieval artist. That's I'm sure of. And then when the carbon dating came out, saying it was from 1260 to 1390, as a good scientist who listened to what the data was saying, the evidence, he said, okay, well, I don't know how it was made, but it has to be medieval because that's what the carbon dating said. And he heard that Benford and Marino were questioning that and with this theory about the reweave, and his reaction was, but I've got the samples from near the patch, near the corner that was taken for the dating and from elsewhere on the cloth. I'm a chemist. I've got the evidence now. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes. He called them fringe people. They're out on the lunatic fringe, he said. And then, you know what he did? He did the tests on those samples, and he went on the record before he died on video record saying, I set out to prove them wrong. You know what I've done? I've proved them right. And he actually published a scientific paper in a peer-reviewed journal called Thermochimica Acta shortly before he died, presenting the evidence that the corner of the cloth that had the carbon dating done was actually a contaminated part that had extraneous material woven into it during probably a reweaving process at some point, possibly, it could have been, it was hundreds of years after the date that they came up with, and the contamination of the cloth appears to be what resulted in the apparent age when the carbon dating was done. So all of us researchers, scientists, historians, and lots of people who are fascinated by this object, by the Turin Shroud, have been lobbying for a long time to the owners of the shroud, who happen to be through the way that history has gone, it's been given to the Vatican. Well, we've been lobbying them to allow another carbon dating to be done using parts from other parts of the shroud away from the corner, but to date they haven't done this. So the age of it looks to be way older than the carbon dating said, and in terms of Where from? Well, there were some researchers, two of the main researchers who have been looking at this are actually pollen experts, botanists. One was a Swiss forensic consultant called Max Fry back in the 70s, and more recently Professor Avinoam Danin of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who is also a pollen and plant expert. They've looked at the evidence on the shroud regarding pollen grains and so on of where it might have been, and they found, of course, that there's pollen there as we would expect from France and Italy. We all know it's been in France and Italy, but also they found things that point to it having had a Near Eastern and Middle Eastern history, both around the area of Turkey and also around the area of Jerusalem. Okay, so you see, they actually, I went to a paper that Professor Danin presented, and there are 3 different pollen grains on there, which when you triangulate them together to see where it might have been, they point to just a small area around Jerusalem, and these plants, they produce their pollen around March or April. So it appears that the shroud was at one point in its history exposed to the elements around March or April in Jerusalem. So we might say, well, when would that have been? Well, the forensic experts will tell us that it's got the bloodstains and forensic evidence that it once wrapped the body of a crucified man who had been crucified according to the Roman custom of how they used to torture and crucify people. But the unique characteristic regarding how he was tortured was the cap of thorns that was placed upon his head. Now, when was this? Well, it would have been when the Romans were occupying Judea, and we can narrow it down sort of to a narrower interval than that, because for most of the time that the Romans were crucifying people, they were leaving them out to the elements as a deterrent, to tell people this is what happens if you disobey Roman law. They were just getting attacked, having bits bitten off them by animals and birds and whatever. Now, there was a short period between 6 and 66, whether we call it AD or Common Era. There was a short period where there was a figurehead in Judea, a Jewish figurehead that the Romans allowed to try and keep the peace. They allowed him to at least be there and be a figurehead, so the people thought that they had some sort of representation, that they weren't completely dominated by the Romans. And because he had some token powers, he was allowed to negotiate with the Romans. Okay, we can't stop you crucifying the local people, the Judeans, but at least let them have a traditional Jewish burial according to the customs that they have, which is that it needs to be a quick burial. You see, so you can't just leave a dead body hanging around on a cross for days and days and days. As soon as you can after they've died, they have to be taken down and buried. Now, the man on the shroud was buried very quickly after death. He was wrapped in the shroud. We know from the bloodstain evidence that he was wrapped in the shroud at the most within 2 hours of his death. And there's no evidence of putrefaction on the cloth or any sign that the body had bits of it eaten away by scavengers, animals, birds, or whatever. So it looks as though this is a man who was tortured and crucified in the unique way that is referred to in anecdotal historical accounts of Jesus of Nazareth, cap of thorns, around Jerusalem in March or April at some point between 6 and 66 AD.
The fact that we were able to narrow that to that area is important, and I'm glad you talked about the inconsistency with their carbon dating, because yes, they did use the corner, which, as you said, the French nuns were using the invisible weave method. So I think most researchers on the Shroud of Turin now accept the fact that first carbon dating was wrong, because that's not where it was a repaired area. But now let's go back to the era, right? The time that this has happened, that 6 to 66 Common Era. Obviously, this was a very important person to whoever wrapped him in the shroud, and very important throughout the church's history, and anybody in Christianity for these 2,000 years to have kept the shroud. They wouldn't have just picked anybody who was a family member to do so, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the people who would have looked after the shroud would have been his followers way before there was any sort of organized religion called Christianity as such. But yes, I mean, it's been preserved for a long time. It must have been considered to be of considerable value to the people around its history from the beginning, presumably until now. Yes, and I mean then we come, of course, to the important question regarding the nature of the actual image of the man on the shroud, which for centuries was thought to be just a faint image that you could just about make out, that you have to be several feet away before you can see it. And people said, yeah, I suppose that does look like the front and back of a man, although it's quite indistinct, these sort of sepia tones of discoloration on the cloth. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, in 1898, there was a photographer by the name of Secondo Pia who was given permission to take photographs of the Turin shroud for the first time. And now this was, of course, in the old days of photography, where they used to have big photographic plates that used to be exposed as a negative and so on, and then made into a positive. Now, the story goes that when Secondo Pia took this picture of the shroud, he had the photographic negative plate, that he nearly dropped the plate in shock when he saw the image that was upon this plate. Now, you see, if you look at and you can all do this online, there's plenty of good pictures of the shroud. For example, if you go to shroud.com, Barry Schwartz, who was an official photographer for the Stirp team, has got lots of pictures of the shroud on there. Now, if you look at a photographic negative of the shroud image, it suddenly switches from a vague imprint that looks like a man, and until it suddenly becomes in very high resolution that you can make out all the features virtually. And it's now this is amazing. For those who think that the shroud image was made by a medieval forger in the 13th or 14th century, they have to account for why this forger would have made an image whose resolution and character would only be discovered several hundred years later, once photography was invented. Set aside the fact that the forger would have had to have known how the crucifixion had to have, but not just that, somebody would have had to have been.
Oh, we lost him.
Dr. Silverman? Dr. Silverman? Your audio cut out. Are you still with us? Painter, you're with me, right? Yeah, he's lost.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, hop in whenever you want. That's why I started IMing you on his end.
Well, yeah, he's doing good. We're still recording, by the way. I've talked to Nigel. I can't pronounce his name right. Kerner, and he says the same thing. I've checked into the Shroud of Turin. I think it's a pretty amazing artifact. I'll call it that instead of artwork, because I don't think it's artwork. I'm an artist myself. I know, certain things by looking at certain things, and it just doesn't appear to be what do you call it? Something man-made. There's too many characteristics there that doesn't align.
Exactly, and it not just it's the 3 dimensions is what really gets me, and obviously this was very important to all these people because they needed him I'm sorry. It was clearly important to all these people to preserve this in such a state for these 2,000 years.
Right.
And it went from around the world, essentially, not really around the world, but it went from Jerusalem to, that's the next thing I want to get with.
Somewhere in France it was lost for a little while, and then it was refound. And I'm not sure. I don't have any data pulled up because I didn't expect to be doing this, you know.
No, I completely understand.
So,
We lost him again. I am going to try to get him back on real quick.
yeah, going across the Atlantic with Skype is a iffy thing a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly. Especially then, you know.
Okay, all right, everyone. Well, that was a whole lot from Dr. Silverman. That's just part one of it. We're going to have a little more playing. Just wanted to catch everyone up on what's going on. Dr. Silverman was the head of the research team of a lot of leading scientists with modern-day technology and a lot of technology that's really not being used out there in the main science world. It's top-level things. Of course, had the opportunity to examine a rare artifact like the Shroud of Turin, and it's not often that opportunity comes up. They did a really good job. They were trying to be as thorough as they can. There was a lot of questions in regards to the carbon dating that had taken place, the first round with science. And according to Dr. Silverman and a lot of scientists before had mentioned, the sample that they were allowed to take for carbon dating, it was kind of a damaged part of the shroud. It had a little partial damage from a previous fire. It had been touched up. The weaving patterns had been a little bit changed, which was similar to how early French repair weavers were working at that time. And to them, it's pretty obvious, but there will be skeptics involved, I'm sure. They're really trying to do the best they can, obviously, with the limited time they have to work on it. But it's obvious. And I'm talking on the science level and the research level. Dr. J and Mad Painter were doing an excellent job speaking with Dr. Silverman. He's an excellent doctor alone. He's an excellent researcher. If everyone heard, to them, it puts the shroud right in that area. It puts the shroud in the Jerusalem area around that time. Not only that, all the markings left on the shroud are exactly how it was said, and it doesn't stray from it at all. It's too perfect to be a hoax. It's something that just can't be hoaxed. To have the impression that was left, it clearly can't be duplicated. Hello, Tim. Are you with us?
Hey.
Tim, how are you?
Hi, Billy. Hello?
Hello, you there, Tim?
Yes.
How are you today?
It's bad connection.
So what did you think about the first part of Dr. Silverman?
Truth is, my computer took a enormous crap.
Okay.
And, are we on air?
Yeah. Yes, you were on air, yes. I'm sorry to hear that about your computer.
Yes, it did. And it was right at the nick of time, too, because you were actually calling me as it took a crap. But
right.
What are you going to do?
So did you get to hear much of Dr. Silverman?
I only heard a little bit, actually.
Yeah, he was saying that the shroud itself, let's start from the beginning. It was a great length, the shroud. It's 14 feet in length. And
right.
at that time, that's very rare to have one particular length of cloth at that length.
Unless they're like a nobleman.
Right. These were still handmade at the time. Granted, they perfected the method, but it was still expensive. It was costly. Most fabric wasn't even produced that large. It's too time consuming, and that much fabric could have made clothing for a family at that time. And
Sure.
it's a beautiful cloth, one that they it would have wrapped a Egypt pharaoh in. Dr. Silverman even said he was wrapped like Jesus was like a pharaoh. The way he was wrapped. He was cared for after death by the regards of the shroud to be that of a king. Someone highly respected. It was clear to them, which he mentioned here in the first part, that this shroud was wrapped around this individual approximately within 2 hours after his death, and they know that from the blood that's seeped out and how far it's run in certain places, and they're quite sure he was aware of thorns. It's very consistent with the thickness of the blood that had come out. That these weren't little cuts and scrapes. That these were wounds on his head, and he was beaten good. There was full evidence of that, and he's
It's pretty clear that this man was tortured beyond any normal torture. Just looking at the shroud, from just looking at the wounds, and I've read up, from what I've read on it, you can tell the amount of blood that is actually on the shroud, and they did prove that is actual blood. Is that right?
Oh yeah. They definitely proved it was blood. It's what they're really, it's tough when something is looked at so thoroughly scientifically, and with a team of researchers with full attention on one particular thing. It's rare they don't come up with a solid theory as to what's possible, because if just because we can't duplicate it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
It's a tough one to play. So they look at it with all eyes and from all angles, and it's just all the pieces of the puzzle were pointing the same way. And this person would have had to have gone through the same torture and crucifixion process as Jesus did. It's that simple. In their opinion, that this person, if this was not Jesus, suffered the same exact death, and leading to it. He was definitely someone was of the description of Jesus, beaten, tortured, and crucified in the same way, has left in a negative impression on this shroud. It's as if a very bright light, a minuscule nuclear explosion happened within the wrappings of the shroud and exploded outward and left an impression on the shroud. Just as
one can always, I personally appreciate it when you hear someone speak to it in terms of science rather than the religious aspect of it, because then you look at it from a completely different perspective, more of a detective's perspective. That's really it is a unique way to look at these types of, these religious artifacts. And I mean, this one, it's hard to even call it just a religious artifact. It really is. It's an iconic piece.
Right, I agree with you. I would have to imagine the Holy Roman Catholic Church, Vatican. I would imagine that they feel very confident in this, because it's far from the usual norm that they give any artifacts or any of their belongings out for anything at all.
Right.
I mean, the Vatican Library, for one, I mean, that's a treasure trove. I would thoroughly enjoy as much time as I could possibly have in that room. But I know that will never happen.
Detector test. If the lie detector test says you're lying, then the rest of the public's going to think you're lying, regardless of whether you are or not. You're relying on the proof that someone else is determining.
You're right on, because these scientists are, and as we will find out in the rest of the broadcast, will be explaining how confident they are, and we have to remember that they didn't seek out to say, is this Jesus or not? They just wanted to know how did this happen? What are we looking at here? And who could this be? I mean, of course, they were fully aware of who they thought was in there, but you're not going to get anywhere keeping that in mind. And it's really great. It's really cool that they're talking to not just mainstream media about it and trying to get it out there, because even they're suggesting everyone must always, you got to do your own research. You could follow mainstream media if you want. That's your choice. I could help you with choices if you like. But you could come to Revolution Radio, Freedom Slips, and you could get direct science, direct news, and you'd be the judge. They're putting the science and the research out there and letting you look into it. He told you where to go, Turin.com, and you could go there and you could look at the Shroud, and you could see a lot of the work that they've done on it. And they're what science is all about. I mean, if I were out there being a research scientist, I can't even imagine. I guess the whole reason I'm not is 99% of that field you're doing lab work, and being monotonous is far from anything I'm interested in doing in this lifetime. But this Shroud, Tim. Let's see. I could tell you with all honesty that I'm not sure that I was on the side that it was Jesus, and it's for a lot of reasons. Basically, like, we really don't have much physical evidence at all from biblical texts. It's and the ones that we do have, there's many skeptics to agree that. So there's really not much that we have definitive physically for a lot of the Bible stories, which is amazing considering the passion that people put in their faith. So this is highly debated, and I'm sure a lot of religious people are even meeting it with being Jesus is, because if this happened, we're going to have to figure out how long was he in that shroud for, right? I mean, if they know he was definitely dead within 2 hours, we're going to have to find out how long could this person have been in there, because basically, I believe what he was getting at right there, Tim, was rigor mortis hadn't set in. There was no sign of scavengers or any little critters or bugs messing around with it. So it couldn't have been very long. And
it's a 2,000-year-old forensic scene,
right?
Which is not exactly the easiest thing to come across. I mean, think about it. What do we have here? We have a piece of linen, and we have burns with some bodily fluid on it. Really,
right? Yeah.
2,000 years old.
Yeah.
And even with the best equipment, you're going to have at least some error. And it is quite amazing that they can get as much data as they do. But it'd be interesting to see where it does go from here.
Right. Let me ask you another question, because I know you've been very equal-minded as long as I've known you. You've been very equal-minded and understanding on all aspects of religion, and you look at them in a very very kind way. Do you think if these guys are saying with confidence that they believe it to be Jesus, do you think that will be met with much criticism in the church communities?
Well, obviously, I think that some will be joyous and will
right.
basically be, calling it basically they're going to be very happy that their dogmas and their doctrines have been solidified. There's going to be a lot of issues, but you know what the real fact of the matter is that historians do agree that the man lived. The man was a real human on the earth. And, just with that knowledge, it's enough to at least accept the fact that, yes, that could be his body.
I know, but, all we have is the trust of many authors. And I give them the benefit of the doubt because authors, there were many who wrote of it. So profoundly that, their lives were literally changed, and these people dedicated their lives for generations to spreading his word from corner to corner. But he was wrapped like a Jewish king, and he was put in a stone tomb with a large stone covering the tomb, which I always was pretty confident that at Jesus' time they were still using the great deal of Jewish burials were still ossuaries, the little stone boxes they put the bones in. But I guess that always came later, long after rigor mortis.
They may have used.
Yeah, I'd like to check on that. But I do know from many Jewish friends I've had about the speedy burial in their religion. I know I had one teacher used to say when they died
that the early Christians using the catacombs, I actually got to see them when I was in Rome. They're actually located right outside of the city, and that that form of burial was primarily as everybody knows, to escape their persecution. But that was very close to the same time period as when Christ was supposedly put into the tomb. So and I was always under the impression that the tombs were pretty much for noble people, kings, queens, that sort. But it's interesting.
Yeah, I would relish that opportunity to walk through those catacombs. How did you?
Oh, it was quite
that was stellar for you.
What's that?
You really enjoyed that? Was it?
Oh yeah.
Was it? How was it? What was your initial emotion to it? Was it overwhelming? Did it feel dark?
When you step down there, and Italy is a lot different from the United States as far as when you go to look at any kind of archaeological site, even like the Roman Forum. There's no real barriers. You can pretty much just walk around and sit on a column if you want, if there's a stone there, and nobody's going to tell you that you can't do that. Whereas in the States, you can't touch anything.
Right.
And it is pretty amazing, actually. You get a much more intimate feel for what your experience is. And yes, the catacombs were exactly that as well. The tour guide basically was in front, and then you have a line of tourists. In our case, it was like 10 or 11.
Line of Americans.
I stayed in the back, and I went off on my own, and I got lost for a minute. But I found my way back because it's a labyrinth down there. Let me tell you, it's quite a maze, and there's you get the feeling that it's not so much the eerie feeling that you're not alone, but just the fact that how many
that you're in ancient footsteps, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That just everything that goes with it, even just the people that were making them, the conditions that they were in, most likely slaves, but hard work nonetheless. I could tell you, hard work nonetheless. These were dark times, and I'm sure they were digging them quick. But what was left down there? Was it just ruins? Was there many artifacts left?
There was some stone relics, but nothing. And they actually would put them aside, some of the pieces, but for the most part, most of them were empty. It looks like they had either been raided developed throughout the centuries.
Is this where there was like little carved out areas in the walls to just
Right,
stack the bodies
right.
in, right?
Little cubby holes, one
Yeah.
or two, sometimes 3, 4 up, and then there was even some sections where it was like more of a mortuary type where they would go up, and the cavern was actually more like 15 feet deep at one point, and it just lined the walls. It was pretty interesting, but I think that the reason that there really aren't any bones there is there was a relic craze throughout the centuries where the martyred Christians were, their bones were used as, well, it was a trade actually. It was quite an industry, and just even a bone, a fragment of a bone would be worth something.
Man, I would really, I'd really like to get there and check that out, but it's just not top on my list. I don't even know where I would top my list out. I think if I had to pick my list right now, my first spot would have to be the Holy Land or Egypt right now, just because of, as you know, Tim, the book I'm trying to finish up here, and as Tim knows, I'm going to be making a few suggestions relating to antiquity in these areas from basically from the Old Kingdom of Up. Folks, we'll be back in just a little bit, and we'll get right back to it. Tim, just hang out with us if you can, pal.
All right, thank you.
Welcome back to Researchers on a Mission Radio. I'm your host, Joe Kiernan, and we do have Mr. Tim C. hanging by, so I'm going to try to get to Tim real quick so we can get him out of here. I'd love him to stay around. He's a wealth of information. The guy can speak on many topics. Quickly, before we do that, Tim, I'd like to remind everyone we are the world's largest listener-supported radio. We do gladly accept donations, just as anyone else would, but ours are going to an excellent cause of providing a fantastic platform for many hosts to speak on many topics and get much highly debated news right out there live mainstream. This is the way to go for listening to all modern-day research. All the research you want is provided. You can find here on freedomslips.com. We encourage you to make your own conclusions. That's the same when you're listening to any of our news programs or any of the programs across the board. We just recommend you taking it all in, getting the real news, the real info, and making your own decision. If you can go to freedomslips.com, kindly drop a donation in there. Big, small would be great if we had a lot of people, but we would really like to have a large donation. They're very helpful. This does provide a studio time for all the hosts, and let's not forget about the seed pack, which would really complement a $100 donation. You get 34,000 plus seeds, non-GMO. You could keep them good for 15 years, refrigerated, 25 years, frozen. You get everything you need for cultivation, irrigation, water filtration, Boy Scout manual, the works. Breakout bag, and everything you got in the bag, ready to go. It is an excellent life insurance plan if you want to stay alive. If you want a life insurance plan for when you're dead, you need to contact your insurance agent. Tim might even know an insurance agent. But, Tim, are you there, man? We might not have Tim.
I'm here.
Oh, Tim, I hear you, buddy. I hear you. So, I'm trying to get into that area, Tim. I'm hoping to make a trip over to Egypt, Greece, Middle East area.
You better go before that place blows up.
I could say the same about here. Trust me, it never seems good. As you know, Tim, I've been a big Edgar Casey guy since I was a wee lad. And and of course, he says when it all comes down, the Carolinas are going to, the first thing that goes is the Carolinas are going to drop into the sea. And being the huge Edgar Casey fan I've been my entire life, I uprooted myself and entire family to immediately on the Carolina coast. It's comical. In my own life, I find it comical because it's like one of the biggest rules I followed. I blindly walked right into it. And I can see why, because I honestly can't think of a better place I'd want to live. It's absolute paradise to me.
I actually, on vacation, I visited the Edgar Casey Research, I believe it's Institute.
Oh yes, that's right.
I'm sure about that. But what they did tell me there, one of the girls there, they told us that Edgar, during one of his readings, actually said that Virginia Beach, which is where the research facility is,
right,
is where he chose to actually reside and retire, because apparently that is one area that's not going to be hit by anything devastating as far as natural disasters for the next 100 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with that guy. He's right on, and he wasn't over the top throwing it in your face, but he just kind of put it out there gently and simple, and it was pretty incredible. I mean, really incredible stuff. I mean, it's another library I could spend days in is the Edgar Casey library. But, he has so many volumes of books, and it's the same story in every book, in the sense that he's right on. I mean, the guy's right on. And it really was most intriguing was how he went about attaining that knowledge.
Well, what's interesting is that only half of that library is his readings. There's another section of the library that is all esoteric and, a lot of medical volumes and volumes of medical diaries and reference books. But I did find quite a bit of interesting reads in there, definitely. I was only in the library for an hour or so, and I could have spent another week.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've always been a firm believer of a universal mind that there's really no thoughts that originate with me, in the sense that there's nothing I'm going to think of that hasn't been thought of already. So therefore, the answer exists. It's possible with thought. Granted, you can't just think of everything. Some things you need to guide yourself to it with, if it's a multi-phase. But Edgar Casey was one that would say the same thing, that you are smart. Whether you are intelligent or not is another question. But you have the ability physically with your mind to attain this global or universal wealth of information. Where all knowledge sits there.
Access.
Everyone
can access these, the halls of memory and whatever it may be.
Right.
It's very interesting stuff.
Oh, he was the man. He was definitely the man, and it's interesting how a lot of people historically that kind of fall into the same category, they're all known as healers. Like that was Casey's driving force. I mean, he just wanted to open the hospital.
That's how he started. You're right.
Yeah,
and that's primarily what he wanted to do.
And
it was the media and the glitz that really forced him into the more paranormal.
I always found it so interesting. I'm not going to say there's direct correlations, but it's always interesting people like that. Like even here, we're talking about the possibility of Jesus, and Edgar Casey was kind of the same thing. Jesus was a healer. Edgar Casey, he just wanted to heal. And a lot of that comes through just mental insight. It wasn't just all curing diseases. Some people just need to see things a different way, or it's something that they've already known. They just haven't seen it that way before. It's like looking into one of those pictures. If you stare long enough, you could lock on to another image behind it, and it's almost like a whole new light just shined on you for when you lock onto that. You say like, wow, it's right there.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead. No, I was just saying it's usually right there, but sometimes you need to be told how to see it. That's how it all is.
Right.
No.
Edgar Casey, he another fact about him I thought, which was interesting, because a lot of people think of him and they think, well, when you're talking about more of a New Age type thought, because that's what, I mean, honestly, you go into a bookstore and you're looking for a book on Edgar Casey, you're not going to find it in the religious section. However, he actually read the Bible front to back.
Right, he was a preacher's. He was a preacher's son, wasn't he?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think he might have even done a little preaching himself in the early days. I think under his father, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm not confusing him. For someone else, I'd be so embarrassed. I know the man well. I think he did. I know he was a very strong Christian. He had firm beliefs. He was a religious man for sure. No doubt about that, top to bottom.
And it's odd that he didn't remember his readings. In other words, after he would give a reading, he was in that state, his trance-like state.
Yeah.
And he had no knowledge of it. He would have to listen to the recordings afterwards, or take his family's word for it, whatever transpires.
Right, but I mean, there's people like Einstein, just in recent times, who got his best ideas from dreams. Professor John Searle with zero energy, he's got that from his dreams, and Tesla. I mean, it's there. The info's there. Unfortunately, our subconscious mind is only catching these things in our sleep, but there are other people who could control that a little bit, like Edgar Casey. He was just able to. He just knew exactly when that point was, and that's quite profound to be so aware of that. I mean, that's amazing. But I'll tell you, every time if you're taking a nap in the middle of the day, and you feel yourself drifting in and out, if you try to hold yourself there, I mean, that's a pretty good place. And, I just don't have that ability. I end up just blinking 3 or 4 times and I'm gone. Good night. Good night. But Tim,
yeah, no, you're definitely right. But the problem is that not everybody gets to take naps.
Right. Well, I don't get them as much as I'd like.
Yeah.
But I also don't get to sleep as much as I'd like either. That's the problem, having 3 young children. And it seems like every week that goes by, I have less and less time. But I know you don't have much time, Tim. And before I get way off on this here, I don't want to lose everyone and say we are supposed to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so everyone at home, what we were doing is we were just talking on topics related and unrelated. The Shroud of Turin. We have Dr. Silverman. We did one part of it for 30 minutes. We're going to play another 35-minute, I believe 39-minute clip here. And at the end of it, hopefully we'll touch on this again. Tim, if you want to call back in, if you're able to, great. If not, if anyone else out there would like to call in, I will post the phone number in the chat room again. And let's get right to it here. And Tim, I appreciate you calling in as always. And it's my pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Outermost surface fibrils. And if you study chemically the changes that have happened in the image forming areas, what you see is that the fibrils that having the image are all those fibrils are the same color. So what makes up the variation in shading, the intensity of the image, is not the color of the fibrils, but the proportion per unit area of how many of the fibrils have been discolored. So it's a bit like the pixels in a newspaper print, if you like, with the dots. But then if you study in what way they've been discolored, what you see is it's a kind of premature aging of the cellulose in the fibrils, which is very similar to what happens, you know, the yellowish sepia color that paper turns when it's exposed to ultraviolet light in old books and so on that have been exposed to sunlight. Oh. Well, it's very similar to that. It's a chemical change rather than anything that's been added. So then this chemical changes happen to those surface fibrils in a way to form this photographic negative image. And then one of the inspirations for how STIRP came to be formed was there was a researcher by the name of Dr. John Jackson, who's a physicist at the University of Colorado, who was at the time working for the American Air Force, I believe, and they had technology that had been used a few years earlier by the NASA missions with lunar reconnaissance and so on, called an image intensifier, BP8 image intensifier, that was used to look for distance encoding in images. So basically, you put a photograph in there, and you translate the intensity of the image into relief coming up out of you in 3 dimensions, so to speak, up out of the 2-dimensional image. And if you put an ordinary photograph in this VP8, what you see is a random set of peaks and troughs that have no relation to the actual shape and pattern 3-dimensionally of, for example, of a human face. But I mean, John Jackson is said to have had his own eureka moment, if you like, when he put a picture of the shroud in the VP8, and he saw that the man of the shroud was coming out in very good, accurate 3D relief. That it's different to any photograph, because you see, when you take a photograph, the intensity of the image isn't related to the distance that the photographic lens is from the part of the skin on the person that you're looking at, because it's reflected light. Well, with the shroud, it is inversely proportional to the distance, such that if you imagine the cloth were sort of hanging down flat in front of the body, the distance that the cloth would be between the cloth and the skin, the closer it is, the more intense the image. And so when you put it in the VP8, you see that you have very clear distance encoding on the front and the back of the image. Now, so if we take the evidence that we've got so far about the image, that it's only on the surface fibrils, only on the superficial fibrils, it doesn't go beyond that, and it has photographic negative properties as well as distance encoding. Well, I think that's what led several researchers, including Dr. Jackson, to speculate that there may have been a short, intense burst of radiant energy that came from the dead body of the man that the shroud wrapped. Now, that sounds like a bizarre thing to suggest, but that is consistent with how the image could have formed, and we haven't got any way of explaining how the image could have been manufactured. Obviously, other people have other theories about how it could have been formed, but this one has been tested quite carefully. Obviously, not with a corpse that's shining, but using sort of technology to replicate the effect of short bursts of intense radiant energy upon a cloth. And there's a Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro of the ENEA of Frascati, which is the Italian Atomic Energy Research Institute, and he's done research that has been again published in peer-reviewed journals, where they've taken pieces of linen and exposed them to short, intense bursts of radiant, basically of ultraviolet light. And they found that if they have exposures of tiny, billionths of a second, if you like, of ultraviolet light, that they can actually get a similar discoloration of the surface fibrils only of the linen, because you see what's called hard ultraviolet light, the shorter wavelength ultraviolet light, it gets absorbed very readily by even tiny little layers of cloth or fiber, so that it can only interact with the exposed area. And so this is what the evidence is pointing towards for many researchers, not all, but many of us do think that may well be a contender for how the image formed, which of course does leave open the question how and why, and what is this process, and what does it have to tell us about the way physics works, the way the world works, and potentially about the nature of humanity. Is it just coincidence that of all the people in history, the only person who this appears to have happened to, appears in the historical Jesus of Nazareth. That's what the evidence is pointing to, both forensically and palynologically from the pollen, and looking at the things like the cap of thorns and so on, the history of the shroud and how it appears to have come from Judea around the time that he was there, and it was someone who had been crucified in a specific manner that was described as having happened to him with the cap of thorns and so on. And is there some clue there? This is what I wonder, and in my papers on my website, sort of speculate a little bit about this. Is there some clue that might tell us something about the nature of humanity, the potential of all human beings, and also perhaps of the relationship between mind and matter? You see, people looking at the shroud often tend to, there are exceptions of course, but often tend to polarize in different ways. Some will say, oh, it's a medieval forgery. Some will say it's a miracle. We'll never be able to really understand how it happened. And others have obviously lots of other different viewpoints. But my particular view on this is that it doesn't appear to be a forgery. If the people who are postulating that it was a forgery say it was made in the 13th or 14th century and we can't even make it with modern technology, and just say for the sake of argument that people think, you know, you can't understand it, it's a miracle. Well, what's to stop us trying? You know, if a miracle means something that's supernatural, then how do we define nature? I mean, for example, many people assume that it's natural that they, in their life, everyday life, they make choices, they make decisions, they're using they appear to themselves to be using something that we call free will. Now, if there is such a thing as free will, then that means, by definition, if will is truly free to any extent at all, that you could, in the sense that you could have done otherwise than what you did, then that implies that your mind is determining what you do, and that is a form of mind over matter. So, if free will is, there are many people, even in quantum mechanics, physicists, who think that we should acknowledge the existence of free will, and even that empirical evidence points towards it. If you read a book, for example, which has nothing to do with the shroud, but if you read a book called Quantum Enigma by two professors of physics, one of whom was lucky enough to have a chat about quantum physics with Albert Einstein once a long time ago. Well, they put a very coherent and clear case to suggest that actually we need to take this idea of free will and awareness, human awareness, seriously, because it seems to have repercussions for how we actually understand the physical universe itself. Now, if perhaps such a thing as free will is true and mind over matter is true, then perhaps there may be a clue in what this particular individual taught and how he lived that might account for how changes in atoms in that physical body might have happened that led to the image being formed. And as I say, I don't say this in any sense with any religious agenda. I mean, I come from a Jewish background, and I think that actually all the world's major religions at their before they became religions, before they became organized and it became institutionalized, that the people who were around at the start, I think all of them were basically had the same basic message about, you know, human beings should be kind to each other, and that there's a greater state of existence where we can exist, where we don't need physical bodies anymore and can exist eternally. And maybe that is actually something that we will one day see is grounded not in faith but in reason, and that this evidence from the Turin shroud that dead body, that after the body had died, that this amazing thing happened, that maybe there was such a physical event as a resurrection, perhaps. Maybe that is the point where the burst of radiant energy came. But I think we might be able to understand that rationally and with science, once we expand science to give us an understanding better of the mind and where that comes from.
Painter, I know you had a question. Go ahead, Painter.
I just said, or ascension.
Well, I mean, the shroud was wrapping this dead body. It's interesting that you use the word ascension, because there was when I went to a conference at the ENEA, the Atomic Energy Institute in Frascati in Italy, that was hosted and organised by Dr. Di Lazzaro. One of the other speakers there, who is a physician from Boston by the name of Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, gave a very well-reasoned, well-considered, very coherent and cogent case about the difference between the bloodstains and the image. And he made the point that actually, and you can do experiments on this, if, for example, you paint a person's face and wrap a cloth around it when they're lying down, and then you stretch the cloth out again afterwards, you'll see that the imprint of the side of the face goes out wide, so that the face will become circular, if you like, on the imprint. And because he'd always wondered, why does it appear to be that there appear to be bloodstains sort of parallel and even beyond the edge of where the hair is on the image? And then it occurred to him that the bloodstains had occurred while the corpse had been laying flat on the shroud with the shroud draped over it, okay, and had formed obviously by a simple uncontroversial contact process that the moistened what happens when blood begins to clot is that something called serum exudes from it, which is the liquid remnant, and that the serum can moisten the clot, and you'll get transfer of stain onto the cloth within a 2-hour window following death, because of course death is the point where after that your blood stops circulating and you stop bleeding. That's about the bloodstains, but with the image we see something different. With the image, it's as though, and he's careful to say as though, he's not saying this is what actually happened, but although I think it may well be what actually happened, but it's as though when you look at the image, you see something different. You see, if you have someone lying down flat, their hair will drape down behind them. Okay, and also the back of the body will be compressed, it will be squashed, even if rigor mortis is present, because rigor mortis only affects muscle, it doesn't affect skin or subcutaneous fat and so on. So having seen autopsies of cadavers and so on when I was a medical student and so on, I can confirm, as can many other people who have seen the same thing, that you always get, when you lay a body down on a slab, you always get flattening at the back. Now, the blood stains on the shroud are consistent with the possibility that there may have been flattening, but the image doesn't appear flattened at the back. Now, so the image doesn't appear flattened at the back, and the hair, rather than being draped behind the head, is actually hanging down on his shoulders. So Dr. Lavoie was saying it looks as though at the moment that the image formed, that the body wasn't laying flat anymore. It was laying flat when the bloodstains got onto the cloth, but then something happened later, apparently, and this is just from the evidence, that the body appears to have risen up and become vertical. So you might think, oh, okay, then it's standing. How a corpse is supposed to stand, I don't know. But actually, then if you look at the feet, you'll see that one foot is at a higher level than the other, and the toes are pointing downwards, which actually implies, as strange as it may sound, that rather than being laid flat on the slab, at the moment the image formed, the body appears to have been vertical and suspended above the ground. So what are we saying? We're saying that this dead body rose up vertically, was suspended above the ground, and there was a flash, an instantaneous flash, less than a millionth of a second of intense ultraviolet radiant energy going apparently forwards and backwards from the body to form this image. Now, it's interesting that we can only see this evidence now using scientific techniques of trying to use ultraviolet lasers to replicate the chemical changes on the cloth, and also forensically to see that looking at the photographic negative and so on, and the pattern of the bloodstains, we can see the two different positions of the dead corpse and the upright man, or the upright corpse. We don't know that when at the moment that the light shone. Okay, so how did this happen? And is there a clue in the identity and what we know, or what is, at least was written about, anecdotally at least, about this individual, Jesus of Nazareth? Now, there's two things that are very relevant to this that are told about him, that are said to have happened during his lifetime. One is that he was described at times to have risen above the ground, or to have become light as air, to have walked on water and so on, and without sinking. And the other is that he was also referred to at one point, I think it's called the Transfiguration, when he went up on the mountain with Peter, James and John, said to have shone brightly. So those two things that are said to have happened around him while he was alive are also appear to have been, there appears to be scientific evidence that may well have happened after his death to his body. Now, in looking for clues about what this might mean, it's interesting that the anecdotal report about this happening with him, for example, walking on the water, is said to have happened to a friend of his as well. That Peter also was said to have walked on the water, and I think this is a great clue in that he's recorded to have said, all these things you see me do, you also can do. And so statements such as, is it not written, you are gods, to the people, saying to the people around him, humanity in other words. What was he trying to tell us about when he said, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain? Well, if you translate the mass of a mustard seed into energy according to E equals mc squared, then that would be enough to make a small movement in a mountain, because there's a tremendous amount. He appeared to understand these things, but in a much more profound way than is looked at by modern science, because he appeared to be able to tie in the human and the awareness and will characteristics into how the whole thing works, so that he was describing it that in this physical universe, he said, he was describing basically what scientists know as the second law of thermodynamics. Everything rots. That if you have anything that you like, just be aware that a thing that you like, that moths can eat it, or rust can corrupt it, or thieves can take it away. Okay, but there's another way of existing where things aren't prone to being broken down, and it appears that he was referring to another way of existing beyond time and space, which perhaps he was able to reach the interface to that state, that way of being, not through any means of technology, nothing artificial, just through how he lived. After all, the physical universe came from a state of nothingness, where there was no force, no space, no time, no energy, no thingness, and when the universe occurred, immediately it began in a state of separateness, if you like, expansion, the Big Bang. Okay, everything moving away from every other thing, and that's how thingness, if you like, happened. Have been the potential for it to happen. Now, what if as many quantum physicists, such as, for example, himself, you may have heard of the Schrödinger cat story, that he which was actually him poking fun at his own equation, because he said but anyway, that Erwin Schrödinger pointed out that the thing about that, if we want to understand the mind, if we want to understand sentience and awareness, and we want to understand time, which is a crucial thing for any physicist to want to understand, the clue may well be that mind is always now. We're always in the present. And any memory that we have is experienced in the present. Any plan or aspiration we have about the future is within the present. And existing in the present, we have awareness of what we are, what we've become through the choices we've made and the experience that we've had that make up the past. So, potentially is not yet fixed if we have such a thing as free will. Well, what Schrödinger pointed out is that because you need to have awareness and will in order to construct something such as time, rather than all past, present, and future all being one big conglomerate, one big mess, if you like. There's only what we experience as a flow of time because we have this awareness and will. And his point was that we're actually making time, we're creating time, and therefore if we have created time, then time doesn't make or destroy us. We must therefore be eternal. If all awareness, all sentient being is fundamentally has no beginning and no end, and if it has no beginning and the universe came from a state of all being one, then at that point we must have all been one, and perhaps the universe happened out of perhaps maybe not a directive finger-pointing God who's controlling us and molding us and so on, but out of free will and the decisions that we've made separation. And maybe people like Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and so on were giving us clues that there's another way of living where we don't have to break things up, that we can care for a fellow man. And maybe on the Shroud is evidence demonstrated that if we do that, then we're not just changing our minds. Even the atoms themselves might even begin to change, to go back to the original state that we once came from. And perhaps I think that's the significance of the Shroud to me, that it's perhaps showing us the potential that lies latent within all humanity, that there was one man who came and showed us what we could achieve.
You actually just spoke about the question I wanted to actually get to next. Let me comment on one thing. When you were talking about the Jesus resurrection, or the fact that the Shroud implies that he was above ground, again, that also goes on to with what a lot of accounts were at the time of rising in light. I mean, light came, they were talking about light with Jesus Christ from that time. So obviously, if this is evidence that's shown 2,000 years later, then clearly there's something going on. One anomaly in this alone is enough to be looked at. But when you take all these anomalies together in account, you really have something extraordinary. Nothing on Earth is like what the Shroud of Turin, correct?
Yeah, it's unique. There is another object in Spain called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which has blood stains which have been shown to be of the same blood group as the Turin Shroud and of the same pattern, and is thought to maybe, it appears to some forensic people who have looked at it that it may well have wrapped the same corpse. It doesn't have an image on it though, and it's thought that might have wrapped, been put on around his head temporarily and soaked up some of the blood before and been laid somewhere separately in the tomb when he was buried.
Isn't it believed to have healing powers too?
Well, I'm not sure what I mean, I don't know. There may be some people who believe that. I don't know.
Okay, we got a couple more questions for you because you covered some of the most important stuff and we're winding down to the hour. I'm going to save the second one of the lessons to be taught for after this next question. But briefly, if we could talk about the history, how it got from Jesus' tomb to Italy. Can you tell the listeners about that?
Well, it's not known 100% for sure, and of course, people can make the case that it hasn't actually been proven 100% that this would be, this was in Jesus' tomb. You may have heard of people saying that they found writing on it with his death, but there's no real evidence that there is writing on the shroud. The evidence does point strongly towards it having been a man who had been tortured and crucified in the same way that is described to have happened to Jesus, with the unique characteristic of the cap of thorns that points it more towards him. And everything is consistent with it having been him. Whatever this man was called, whether he was called Jesus or something else, the inference for me is the same, that it's showing us a clue about humanity. I mean, personally, the evidence for me is strong enough that I would go as far as to say that I do think this was the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there is some evidence that and you can get more detailed accounts of the evidence if you look at the historians who have studied the shroud, such as Ian Wilson, who was, I think, based in Oxford when he was doing a lot of his research. Now is continuing to do research on the history of the shroud. And for example, there's another very eminent historian by the name of Professor Dan Scavone, who has done a lot of work on tracing the history of the shroud. So I'm not an historian, but as a sort of way of my limited way, and I would always direct people towards their work for more detailed accounts and their books and so on. But for my way of trying to summarize what they're saying, as I understand it, is that the evidence does suggest that it may well have gone from Jerusalem to Edessa in Turkey, which is now called Sanliurfa, and from there to Constantinople. Now, it was for quite some time. It was at the time when anything that was considered to be a religious relic was in danger of being destroyed. That it appears to have been in a crevice and then discovered at a later date there, and it was spent quite some time in Constantinople, where it used to be people used to go there to see it, and for some time when it was in Edessa, it appears to have been folded over so that only the face was visible. And there's some evidence that this is known as something that's known as the Mantilion of Edessa may well have been, some people believe, actually the Turin shroud, but it was reputed to be an image of the face, because if the whole body was shown and it was associated with a dead body, then it wouldn't have been allowed to preserve have its existence preserved. Now, it appears to have been taken from Constantinople, possibly by sort of having been stolen by Crusaders, and there's different theories about how it got there, and the so-called the missing years. And Professor Scavone has written about this as something called the Besançon hypothesis that he's found quite a bit of evidence for regarding the details of where it had been before it got to Lire in France, and then from then on the history is clearer, and it went from, it was in the possession of the Descharnay family, and it was eventually came into the possession of the Duke of Savoy from what had been the Italian royal family, and he when in his will, when he died, I think it was around 1983, he bequeathed it to the Vatican, so that's why they own it now, but it's still kept to this day in the cathedral in Turin, which used to have the Duke's palace was adjoining that. And that's where it is to this day. And occasionally, there are expositions where it can be viewed by the public. One of them was in the 1930s, and then again in 1978, around the time of the STURP research project, and then more recently it's been allowed to be seen by the public, and I've actually been there as a member of the public to see it a couple of times myself there.
I hope we all can have a chance at some point to all visit it, because it's an extraordinary thing. I've seen it only in pictures, and I would love to see myself. Now, coming down to the end of this interview, I want to ask you, how has this work that you've done with the Shroud of Turin changed your life, and what lessons can be taught to everybody else? I know we talked about the sentient beings, the time, what we could be capable of, but what message would you give to all the listeners out there?
Well, I mean, I'm not really anyone to be teaching anyone any lessons. I'm no example of anything at all to speak of. But looking at the shroud shows me that the man whose image is on there is, for me, an example of what humanity can achieve, and that perhaps he taught an antidote to this second law of thermodynamics that breaks everything apart, that may lead to humanity, if you like, rather than evolving, we might devolve and become more artificial as we go into technology, and we lose sight of what's special about us as sentient beings, and try to merge more with machines and then lose our humanity altogether, or even devolve and become more like apes and monkeys and lower forms of life even. So that might be the future for man, if we just follow the natural drift of what happens according to the second law of thermodynamics. Nothing automatically gets sort of better or more ordered of its own. Everything breaks down. So what we can then see is that perhaps there might be an antidote to that if things break apart through division, through separation, that what he taught about loving your neighbor as yourself might well be the antidote to this momentum that breaks everything apart. I've written in more detail about this in the papers on my website, which is lightoftheshroud.com. And including one of a link to a paper that I presented at this Frascati conference, which I was referring to at the Atomic Energy Institute in Italy, where I go into that in more detail. And also I was interviewed by someone, a filmmaker by the name of David Rolfe. That interview is on the website as well. He's actually the man who produced the documentary, The Silent Witness, which, although I hadn't met him at the time, as in my sort of late childhood and teenage years, was actually my introduction to the Turin Shroud.
Now, one final thing. What is in your future with regards to your research and your work?
Well, I think basically because once I'm fascinated by the questions about what the Shroud tells us about the nature of humanity and the potential, but because the majority of the world is still getting bludgeoned by this media reporting that happened in the late 1980s, saying that it's actually medieval. I think that's the main thing, is that we've got to get past first, is to look at the evidence regarding whether it's actually is authentic. To me, there's no longer really much doubt about that, because it cannot be. No one's been able to manufacture anything that's got all the characteristics of the image, with the superficial character of on the surface fibers, photographic negative, distance coded information. And nobody knows how to do that. All the attempts have fallen way short. So for me, I can already see the evidence pointing to it being genuine, but there's still a lot of work to be done for that to be realized, I think, more widely in the world, so that the questions that I would like to ask about the implications of it can have more chance to be considered. And for me, it's far more than just a piece of cloth. For me, it's of all the objects in the world, this one has been the most studied scientifically, probably, with all the hours of research that have been put into it over the years by so many people. And once people recognize that the evidence does point to it being genuine, then the implications of it, I think, are then open for us to consider. And I think once we do that, then it will revolutionize our ideas about the nature of the physical universe and the nature of humanity and what our potential is as human beings. And ultimately, you can see in that when the demonstration of potential, how valuable and precious every single human being is, that in their potential, they're actually limitless and eternal. And then, if we could recognize that, then there's no longer much incentive to want to go around fighting wars and killing each other. So I think, that if the world really takes grasp of this object and its implications and the lessons that can be learnt from the man of the shroud, outside of and independent of any organized institution, but just using reason. And after all, he'd never claimed to say that he'd come to start a religion. He said he came to bear witness to the truth. And for me, I think, what he taught and how he lived, it's the epitome of reason, basically, of sense, of the most rational way to be. It makes much more sense to care, to add together rather than divide, separate, and harm others. That you learn much more if you're interested in people in general rather than just being divided up into different ethnic or national or religious groups, the way that humanity divides itself up and fights each other. So that for me is ultimately what this is a message of, that on that, the image on that cloth is evidence that it is possible for a human being to love their neighbor as their self, and evidence of that can have a real physical effect that we can actually see perhaps 2,000 years later with our modern scientific techniques.
So much amazing information we got from you, Dr. Andrew Silverman. Thank you so much. For everybody out there listening, be sure you find his information at lightoftheshroud.com. Again, www.lightaftershroud.com.
Lightoftheshroud.com.
Lightoftheshroud.com. Again, sorry about that. Lightoftheshroud.com. Follow his work, and we would love to have you back again, Dr. Silverman. Any last words?
Well, just to say thank you very much for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and it's just such a fascinating subject, the Shroud. I could just go on and on. I hope I haven't. I hope it's been of some interest.
It absolutely has, and that's the reason we had you on, is from requests when we had Nigel Turner on. But nonetheless, we want you definitely to come back and keep us posted with any new information. Thanks again, Dr. Silverman.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
All right. I hope everyone liked that. I sure did. Amazing stuff from Dr. Silverman. It's incredible. He's really set on his findings. He's I would imagine when you put so much time in on that level, with the research team he has, it has to be a profound, overwhelming discovery or reassurance, I suppose, in his matter. He's quite confident that it was indeed the cloth that wrapped Jesus in. And a mad painter asked a really good question, or he put a comment in that it was almost like an ascension when Dr. Silverman was describing the very bright flash of light that only lasted for a millisecond. It appeared that the body that was wrapped in this shroud had been vertical. at some point vertical and not standing on the bottom of its feet. Its feet were still pointed down as if floating up, and when it was in that state, what appears to be in a levitational state, the flash of light occurred in a millisecond and left a 3D negative impression on the shroud. Regardless of who the gentleman is, for the sake of the comment, it's a quite profound thing to happen to this of textile here. This is something we cannot duplicate. It's not even, we can't even come close to it. It's something happened, and we have proof that this magical thing happened, and that's really all it is. So we don't know how it occurred. We're most likely never going to understand this, especially the way we go these days.